My name is David Ansara. Welcome to the Centre for Risk Analysis briefing on the violence and anarchy that has swept South Africa over the last week. I'm joined by my senior colleague, CRA Director, Dr. Frans, who many of you will be familiar with. This is a client briefing, but we do have a few of our free trial individual subscribers joining us this evening. So welcome to you if you're new to us. And the CRA is a risk advisory firm. We provide insight into policy, political risk, and economic policy specifically. And we work with organizations and individuals such as yourselves to help them navigate this very difficult and uncertain environment. And the levels of difficulty and uncertainty are at extremely high levels. So we wanted to have this emergency briefing, if you will, to go through the implications, both in terms of the macro picture, the stability of South Africa and its economy, but also help you to understand how that's going to impact on your firm, on your personal life, and help to inform your strategic decision-making going forward. So Frans, what we're going to do is we're just going to have a brief chat, you and I, for about 10 to 15 minutes, where we will go through some of the origins of the violence, some of the underlying causes, and some of the key questions that we've received from our clients over the past week. But then we'll also open it up to you, our audience. There is a chat feature or a Q&A feature where you can post your questions. You can start posting those questions immediately if you like, and we'll get to those in the Q&A. You can also raise your hand and we'll activate your microphone. You can speak directly to Frans and I. So let's get going. So Frans, we spend a lot of time analyzing risks in South Africa, and every morning on a Monday at 7 a.m. we release our risk alert. And the question to you is any of this a surprise to you, the events that we've seen this week?
They're very dramatic events, David. Good evening to you and to our guests. But no, they did not come as a surprise. And I asked our two analyst colleagues who work on those notes with me very closely, Becky and Simpe, to troll back through them over the last year or so. And they flagged 7 precise and specific warnings where we advised clients to gear themselves to the risk of violent and anarchic protest action and looting breaking out in South Africa, which is exactly what the country's been through over the past 96 hours.
So Frans, what do you think are the origins of this violence? Why this sudden upsurge in riots and looting across KZN and Gauteng?
That's actually an area, David, where the analysis is not difficult. We are a country today that demonstrates one of the highest levels of economic exclusion of people from formal participation in its economy of any emerging or developed market. We use an indicator called the labor market absorption rate, and that measures what proportion of people of working age have a job. And the South African figure is sitting a good 20 percentage points off. It's about 40%. Should be 65 to 70 actually. So perhaps it's 25, 30 percentage points off emerging market norms. That's the primary problem here. Against that, real per capita GDP, after increasing very quickly in the first decade of democracy, has been stagnant for the better part of a decade and is now declining. Social grants are no longer being increased. For the last couple of years, this has been the case. At the rate of inflation is experienced by poor households, which is higher than CPI. So those households are getting poorer. And where we had increased the number of people with a job, just a net number, we doubled it between really 1994 and 2007, when Thabo Mbeki departed. Extraordinary thing is that at the end of last year, there were less people with jobs in South Africa than had been the case when Thabo Mbeki was defeated more than a decade ago. These are the deep underpinnings that have given rise to the protests. Now, we advise you to distinguish between two things. There are powder kegs and there are sparks. Every country is going to have sparks. They're very difficult to manage. Radical elements, revolutionary movements, they're all over. Powder kegs are things governments can manage. And in South Africa's case, what I just described to you is the powder keg. The spark that sets it off now and again is not as important at all. We'll get to that later, I think, David, than what's in that powder keg. And put differently, it would be peculiar to us if, given socio-economic circumstances, low growth, the country's reform prognosis, we did not run an ever greater risk of levels of violent protest action and looting breaking out on a massive scale across key parts of the country. David.
So we have structural unemployment, chronic low growth, lack of policy reform to unlock the economy. This is what has created this powder keg. But now the government seems to have been quite flat-footed in its response. Did they not see this coming?
They didn't. It's an amazing failure of security and of intelligence. They did not see it coming. They were taken by surprise by it. Key flashpoints such as the Moy River Toll Plaza that has seen mayhem play out with regular intervals over the past several years were left unguarded. It was really only after this thing started getting real momentum that police leave was cancelled and the defense force was authorized to deploy. So no, the South African government missed this one. They did not see it coming. And we can get perhaps later into a little bit of more of the detail about why that is. But I'll give you this. It reflects the extraordinary level of detachment between what happens on the ground in South Africa and how the country's policymakers, both in the Tuli House and in the cabinet, and I'll go one further, in organized business, perceive the country and the impacts of the policies that come out of cabinet. There is an inability and an unwillingness to assign cause to effect or to join the dots. And I think that explains part of the reason why the government was caught flat-footed, as you say, David, on this thing.
Yeah, Frans, and last week on our CRA YouTube channel, we interviewed Ed Stoddard, who's a journalist who has been investigating the force majeure incident with Rio Tinto Minerals, or Richards Bay Minerals, which is owned by Rio Tinto. And he described the government as being in a blue light bubble, which I thought was a very vivid metaphor. But now you described the powder keg, but there has been a spark that has set this powder keg off. Is that spark Mr. Zuma, who was recently imprisoned?
Yes, well, in this case, he was the spark. If it wasn't him, it would have been something else. And just context-wise, on a normal day of the week, South Africa is a very volatile place. So one of my colleagues, just before this call, found for me the latest numbers from the police on levels of violent protest action in the country overall. And I recall them well enough that I can tell you this. Into the Zuma era, towards the end of the Zuma era, levels of violent protest action were 3 to 4 times higher than what had happened in the era of Thabo Mbeki. Since Mr. Zuma's departure, protest action has become even more intense, and the proportion of protests now that are violent, the last 2 years of Mr. Ramaphosa's administration, is even higher than was the case during the latter years of the Zuma administration. So there's nothing new here. The Richards Bay blow-up you alluded to is just one example of that. This is therefore not a departure from the status quo. It's simply a brief period of much higher intensity, of far more destructive protest action than that which we have already become accustomed to. And I always think an insight into that is we must be one of the few countries in the world where, when we still used to drive to our offices in the morning, the traffic reports would tell you of traffic lights out of order, that also tell you about cash in transit heists and gun battles going on, but they'd also tell you about what intersections to avoid because of high levels of protest action. So there's nothing new in the strategic environment. All that we are seeing is that the level of protest action and its intensity is beginning to lift. So there's nothing new here. On the point that you almost get to, David, of Zuma, this is not orchestrated in the sense of being created, set up, and made possible by some recalcitrant former members of his administration. Some of them, no doubt, have encouraged this, and others have, after the fact, tweeted approvingly or encouraged their partisan political partners in small municipalities to fire the thing up a little bit. But we mustn't overstate that at all. The only reason that has succeeded in as far as it has is that the circumstances in the powder keg were there in the first place. And I must warn you that over the next week, the current intelligence and security apparatus will try very hard to turn the narrative here away from failed reform and away from poverty and unemployment and socio-economic stagnation, to pin this on the old Zuma bogeyman in the hope that we call that creating a rabbit. And the rabbit, it's a very enticing rabbit, it's an old Zuma rabbit, to get the media to chase that rabbit away so that the current administration is not exposed to a withering criticism for allowing these circumstances to persist and the protest to take off. Put more frankly, this is not a problem of the Zuma administration. This blow-up is a problem of the Ramaphosa administration. David.
Okay, so there might be an element of deflection there from the current administration. So Frans, we at the Centre for Risk Analysis are renowned for our scenario planning methodology, and we brief our clients throughout the year on scenarios for the decade ahead and how South Africa might look in the future based on the data that we and our team analyze and present to our clients. But I thought it would be useful just to go through the scenarios slide. So we won't build the whole scenario deck for you. We'll do that in individual client briefings, which you can arrange by speaking to Sherwin, who's on our call. And I think before this call, we thought maybe we need to revise these, but I don't think that that's going to be necessary. I think our existing scenario sets are still in play. And I thought it would be useful, Frans, for you to just take our audience through this and perhaps explain just briefly the two axes that we have presented here.
Yeah, David says an important thing. This scenario set you're going to be here has its early origins probably in around 2014. We sometimes change the axes and the names of the scenarios, but that's as much about marketing and keeping ourselves fresh than that the analysis has changed. It has in fact not changed since 2014. And the scenarios are not going to change as a consequence of this blow-up. Nothing in the strategic environment is fundamentally different to what we anticipated. Now, scenarios work across axes, and there are two axes, you see them here. Well, how we get to those is these are the questions that we think are of the greatest importance to what happens next in South Africa, firstly, and secondly, of greatest uncertainty. So the axis running up and down is for us now the greatest uncertainty. Will the ANC retain its national majority through to the end of this decade? At the top it does, at the bottom it doesn't. The greatest impact axis, the decision that will have the greatest impact on the future of the country, runs east to west. On the eastern, my right, where my hand is, that side of your right of your screen as well, of course, is will an effective reform strategy be introduced? A yes on the right, no on the left. And how that great uncertainty of the ANC survival in power is read against this greater question of impact of whether reform will be introduced, create four quadrants. Each of those quadrants is a potential future South Africa. And what I will do now is, David, I think is going to bring the stuff up for me one at a time, is I'll tell you how these events of the past 96 hours influence the scenarios. Top right is a future South Africa in which the ANC's majority is still above 50%. That's out into the early 2030s. And it's at 50% because it's introduced an effective reform strategy. It's turned. Ramaphosa did it. The long game has succeeded. And we have seen reform and economic recovery, and we are very successful and very stable. If that plays out now, these protests will be the inflection point that finally breaks the inertia within the Ramaphosa administration, frightens it enough that tomorrow morning the call is made. We can't carry on like this. We're going to get into all sorts of trouble, and we see sweeping and profound and fundamental reforms across the economy. And looking back from the 2030s to this evening, you will remember us saying that those protests were not a bad thing, because they are what finally forced the hand of the government. And after this week, South Africa began to look up. That is how the top right scenario plays out. David then shows you the bottom right. And that is very different. It's defeat and economic reform. And what has happened here is the ANC has lost an election, either 2024 or 2029. And there's a group, a movement coalition in charge of the country. And they have brought about reform. And for this scenario, the protests will accelerate that demise of the ANC. We've written a book on this stuff. You can read it. You can look at a lot of our notes. My colleagues will send you all the analyses. We now poll the ANC at very close to 50% on a national level, and amongst younger people who will make up the bulk of the voting market of the next decade, we're polling the ANC quite far below 50%. These protests accelerate its long-term demise. It loses an election, perhaps in 2024. A new coalition arises, or perhaps a new party even after that, and that party introduces reform, and we get out of trouble that way. Third one.
Frans, just to raise your attention to the time, we've got quite a number of questions coming through, so maybe we can return to these if we don't have as much time. But yeah, just making you aware of that.
Number 3, the ANC is again going to lose an election. It is below 50. And it's forced to bring back on board the radical populists, the prodigal sons and daughters that have left in the form of the EFF. The ANC turns exceptionally radical, and no reform materializes, and South Africa becomes a failed state. And these events of this week are the momentum that leads to that defeat and cements the common ground between these two parties, at least their more radical wings. And we are going to get into very serious trouble over the next decade. And number 4, David, is the ANC is going to stay above 50%. And it's going to do so despite having no reform strategy. No one will ever have the numbers to beat it. It stays in the low 50s with just enough of a majority to kind of control the country. But throughout, you will see ever more what many have probably identified for years now, most starkly this week, that the authority of the state recedes. There's not much growth, tax revenues under pressure, a general mayhem and incompetence. And as the authority of the state recedes, some communities will decide to take upon themselves what were once the responsibilities of the state. Private education, it might be a security, the militia that have emerged in the last week is a great example of something we've been anticipating. And what happens is that, yes, South Africa remains at a macro level, and yes, the ANC remains in charge on paper. But in practice, South Africa is fragmenting or balkanizing We call it the enclave future, where some communities will build very robust enclaves that allow them a serious shot at maintaining a reasonable standard of living in circumstances of weak growth and very high political instability. There is no fifth outcome. And South Africa's future, what you will live through if you observe us from abroad, if you live in the country, by the end of this decade, it's going to fit pretty neatly, our call, into one of these four quadrants. David.
Okay, Frans, so the dramatic events of this week are just a single variable, but the scenarios are still in play. Okay. All right. So, but obviously different probabilities can be assigned to those scenarios. So I'm going to ask Sherwin now, before we transition to Q&A, to just launch our first poll. We have about 309 participants on the call. So it would be, I think, very useful to track sentiment of our clients and how they have been affected by these riots. So the question is, how has your business been affected by the riots? And you can select all that are applicable, so you don't have to just choose one. And I see the results coming through here. All right, well, just whilst we wait for those to come in, Frans, we're going to go to questions now, but there are quite a few respondents. So there's a question here from Rob. There are a few questions here around the availability of the slides as well as the recording. So okay, great. So I'm going to end the poll there. And so a third, 36%, have had no direct effect from the riots, but 11% have had direct attacks on their facilities or infrastructure. A very small number, 2%, have had their staff affected and or harassed. But another third have had disruptions of supply chains. And there's also been 19% with financial losses. So I think those are some very interesting aspects there. But I saw that there were a couple of hands that were raised earlier. So I'm going to see if any of the attendees. All right, so we have a question there from Joe. Joe, do you want to activate your microphone? Go ahead, Joe.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Oh. Hi. Thanks for taking my question. Frans, you earlier mentioned that this isn't orchestrated, and that this could be, as you termed it, a rabbit. Could you explore that a little bit further? Because we know that earlier, before Zuma's incarceration, he met with Julius, he met with Sele, he met with the MK veterans. That meeting really disturbs me, and I feel that there is some form of orchestration. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I don't dispute that there are some groups and individuals, particularly around Natal, that are inciting arson attacks and the like, or supporting those or encouraging them after the fact. And sometimes perhaps before the fact. I concede all of that. My point is just that this is not a phenomena that was created by a group of orchestrators, failing which it could not have happened. Those orchestrators took advantage of showering sparks into what was already a powder keg. Had the powder keg not existed, the sparks would have amounted to nothing. And in the week that lies ahead, I would advise that unless some very compelling evidence to the contrary is created, remember the people that are going to create this evidence are very good at what they do. I would advise you to focus more on the fact that this has happened because reform has been delayed. What reforms there have not been very effective in raising the basic living standards of people. There's a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the government's reform strategy, and that contradiction is the desire to grow the economy by drawing higher levels of investment, whilst at the same time doubling down on policies such as expropriation and the more robust dictation of various empowerment edicts and the like that serve in practice as a tax on investment. And that's not a conversation the present administration wants to have. It wants to parcel this up neatly and send it off with a label on it that says, this is the Zuma administration fighting back. Therefore, support us even more because we've almost slayed them. And they are obviously now very afraid. That I don't buy for very many reasons. The Zuma administration is a has-been administration. I saw the polls at Nazareth when he was defeated. Mr. Ramaphosa's popularity was orders of magnitude higher. It's unprecedented polling compared to his then rival, Dr. Dlamini Zuma. This is not that old administration is a weak and feeble thing. And it is not the primary reason for why we find ourselves here. My advice is the primary reason is that we do not have an effective reform strategy. And we don't have that because of the fundamental contradiction that sits at the heart of the Ramaphosa administration. And the events of the past week are the consequence of that contradiction above everything else. David.
Thanks, Joe and Frans. So we did have a similar question from Rob, who asked, is there an organized plan to destabilize the current government with a view towards a vote of no confidence or even a coup d'etat? I don't know if you want to develop on that idea further, but perhaps the integrity of the armed forces and also the security and intelligence personnel. That Thulani Dlomo has been identified in the media as being somebody who was a close confidant of Mr. Zuma, recently recalled in 2019 as ambassador to Japan by Mr. Ramaphosa. Do you think elements like that could still be stirring the pot?
I'm sure they try, and they are to an extent, but you give them far too much credit if you think they're capable of staging this level of mayhem through their own efforts. These are not great and charismatic leaders of men. Bheki Cele speaks, the police commissioner of the 12 suspects they've identified. Let's see if they are arrested. And when they are, if they are, I think you will be disappointed in seeing the most mediocre collection of individuals, really nothing to wow anyone, with a couple of hundred Twitter followers amongst them, who we must believe pulled off this heist. After the fact, of course, now that things have got so out of control, that the government missed it, that the security forces have struggled to restore order, I'm sure there are some of the ex-Zuma administration who think, wow, if this thing gets this out of hand, perhaps there is a shot for us to get it. But I think they are more amazed than anyone else at what the consequences are that have been set off by the jailing of their former leader, David.
Frans, I'd like to go to another poll. So Sharon, if you could launch the second poll question. How has your strategic planning changed following this week's events? Have you reconsidered your personal investment decisions? Have you lost confidence in the government? Have you considered immigration, or nothing has changed? Please submit your answers. All right, so we had a question here in the chat from Giles, Frans, who asks, what is a, quote, an effective reform strategy? Can you give some examples to the types of reforms that we need to see?
Okay, that's a very good question, because this is a major problem in our work and what we see in government policy. There's not a sufficient understanding of how deep the economic crisis is that we find ourselves in. The budget deficit is one of the a good example, is now at a depth that has only been eclipsed on 3 previous occasions since the formation of the Union of South Africa. Only 4 in 100 kids graduate high school with a maths pass of 50% or higher in an economy with a changing structure of GDP means that we've become an increasingly tertiary-focused economy. And I've shown you how far below the global norm our labor market absorption rate sits. Eskom's energy problems are well known to you if you follow our notes, and you'll know our advice there is that, yes, Andre de Ruyter is doing his very best, and he is making some progress in Eskom, but even if he succeeds entirely, Eskom is no longer in a position where it can be expected to contribute very much more than half of what South Africa's energy demand will be at the end of this decade if the economy is to grow at 5%. So this is how deep trouble we're in. What that requires is a fundamental sweeping set of reforms on a scale equivalent to what happened here between the 1980s and the 1990s as we became a democracy. Number one, you say be specific. You must insist on that from analysts. Here you go. You've got to deregulate the labor market, abandon minimum wage legislation, and abandon the forced horizontal application of bargaining council agreements, and replace a lot of labor policy with a system of private voluntary contract, where if you want to work, there's nothing the state can do to get in your way. And that means a return, in many cases, to low-wage labor, which is politically anathema. The politically correct will be very cross with me tomorrow morning in the newspaper if they come across this briefing. The reason for doing so is firstly to give people who were denied the chance of a proper education the opportunity to learn a skill by working that they might later use to increase their incomes. Second reason for doing it is to mop up the vast pools of unemployed young people who sit around day in and day out with no interruption, having no gainful activity to participate in, no sense of achievement, no sense of the dignity that comes from working and going home and saying to your family, I earned this for you. We need sweeping labor market reforms. On Eskom, there have been some belated reform, decisions taken somewhat, the government wasn't totally pleased about the decisions that it was forced to take. They don't go far enough. You've got to break up Eskom, sell the generating capacity and float the price and bring in private competition across the board. On empowerment policy, which serves as a tax on investment, you actually need to scrap it all the way South Africa does empowerment. It is not in a position to tax investment or to increase the administrative and cost burden of investing in the country, because it so diminishes domestic economic competitiveness that we cannot draw the capital to grow, and the consequences of blow up as such as this. You need to replace current empowerment policy with a new idea, which is that you reward firms, give them empowerment points for fixed investment into South Africa, job creation and maintenance, tax payments and contributions to export, and that is it. And thereby align empowerment policy provisions, the best interest of the economy and the country's socio-economic best interest as well. And on education policy, what you need to do is break the power of trade unions and bureaucrats in Pretoria, introduce charter-type school systems, school vouchers. We've written on that at length, which would allow communities and parents to take control of their schools back from bureaucrats in Pretoria. So these are 4 examples. But our energy minister remains very hostile to reforms. The Labour minister would not countenance what I have just said. The education minister, it's just not possible that this could be considered as an option. And on the question of empowerment policy, the political pressures in the country, to which we as a group fortunately are immune, are of such a nature that our proposal goes down very badly. And until all of that changes, reform is not a buffet that you pick the little bits that you like from. It's certainly not a case of fiddling with policies that have already failed. Until the whole gamut is introduced, there is no prospect of raising the growth rate back to the levels it was at between 2004 and 7, and creating as a consequence the lifting in living standards, which is now necessary if we are to avoid a cycle of blowout followed by high levels of a day-to-day, normal daily protest action and blowout and hammer investor confidence time and again. David.
Right, Frans, the polling results are in. 57% have said that they've lost confidence in the government. I've shared those results for quite a while, so I'm going to stop sharing those and go to Dunbar, who has his hand raised. And Dunbar, the microphone is yours if you unmute yourself.
Thank you. 3 very quick but somewhat linked questions. 1, what should be the immediate tactical approach of the government to regain control? 2, should Ramaphosa have a cabinet reshuffle quickly and use the opportunity to get rid of the opponents? And thirdly, COVID and what we're doing. How do they interlink? Perhaps if you can comment on those. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
to take
Dunbar.
back control, I don't think it will occur. I don't think the strategy I set out, but this thing should calm in a couple of days. But we will then go back to our already problematic status quo of violent protest, and blowouts will come in the future. So I think it quietens in a couple of days. What should be done is that the intelligence services and the police's detective service track down one by one, in the same way actually as American authorities did after the storming of the Capitol, individuals responsible and make examples of them, that this kind of behavior is not tolerated. Short of that, if you issue a threat, as the government has done over recent evenings, that this will not be tolerated, and you don't deliver on that threat, all that happens is that you embolden the sort of criminal elements that exploit these opportunities to loot. I don't think the security forces have the ability to do this anymore. And you must think of another thing. We are of the view of that it's beyond socioeconomic circumstances as dire as ours now, and a growth prognosis as poor as ours. You don't have an alternative plan B to let the security forces govern the country. The previous regime's security forces were much more competent and capable than what we currently have, and much more ruthless and brutal, and did not have the political concerns that the ANC would have. And they could not maintain order under these circumstances. So I don't think it can be done other than through addressing the fundamentals, and that means reform. Should Mr. Ramaphosa do a reshuffle and appoint a reformist administration? Absolutely, yes. He should, in theory. In practice, he won't, because, and here we get a lot of pushback from clients. We don't think Cyril Ramaphosa is a reformer. We think he is part of the problem. And many of the positions that he has championed since coming to power, on raising minimum wage levels, on doubling down on the influence of teaching unions, to the enthusiasm with which he has spoken of what good might come from expropriation, have helped to create this very problem. Beyond that, and him as a reformer, which is the fundamental problem in our analysis, is where does he pick a reformist cabinet? We did an assessment. A lot of the cabinet will be picked out of the executive leadership of the ANC. Now, we did an assessment of that leadership, and we found that more than half of senior ANC leaders are now implicated in allegations of corruption, serious enough that if they are true and they're prosecuted successfully, the person in question could be sent to prison for 15 years, while a lot of the balance that is not openly corrupt is ideologically so far left of center that they would never entertain the kinds of policy proposals that we make here. So we think there's a dead end now, and we think it's stuck. We don't think he's going to introduce profound reforms. And David will later, I'm sure, take me to explain what we think will happen from here. We won't leave you hanging. On COVID, yeah, the response has been disappointing. We should have vaccinated our way out of a third wave before it occurred. And if we, but perhaps on the numbers we're seeing now, a fourth wave may be avoided if supply constraints do not bottleneck between now and November and December, when we'd otherwise anticipate that fourth wave. But the damage done by the pandemic, and mainly the response there too, in a country that cannot afford stimulus measures, is immense. And it was, in a sense, we've spoken about Mr. Ramaphosa as the spark, Zuma as the spark, on the back of a really tough decade in which life got much more difficult for many millions of people. The lockdown was devastating, and I think created the desperation, and particularly when it was so prolonged, longer than it should have been, that becomes an important explanation in diagnosing why things blew up a few days ago. David.
Frans, what I've done is I've launched a poll which asks our audience which scenario they think is going to materialize. So these questions are based on the four that you see on your screen. So the first is, will the crisis finally prompt Mr. Ramaphosa to introduce reforms, restoring stability to the country and setting it up for growth? Then we also have, will the crisis trigger an election defeat for the ANC and a new administration to set the country up for growth? And then also similar, which would be the lower left-hand quadrant, the ANC does not achieve a majority in 2024, but forms a radical coalition with the EFF. And South Africa becomes a failed state. Then the final scenario is the ANC maintains a slender political majority. Reform never materializes. So that's the stasis and stagnation. All right, so we've had a pretty even spread across those, but the majority, 60%, believe that muddling along is going to be the. There we go. So I've shared the results there. So yeah, I think most people see a kind of drag along the bottom materializing. What are your thoughts on that, Frans? Where do you assign probability?
Yeah, that majority view here, the 61%, is not necessarily right. And beware here the risks of inertia in your own thinking. Great shifts in the political and economic circumstances of countries or the world are never predicted with any great degree of accuracy. And the reason is that analysts are afraid to go beyond the narrow status quo and tend to rely on short-term trends to make long-term predictions. And you'll see this in economic growth forecasts for any economy. Very rarely will the forecast for a given year between the central bank, the commercial bank, and prominent economists be very different. They'll all vary around what we call a midpoint base case, which is that muddle along scenario. It's the midpoint base case. However, there's a term in scenario thinking called twin tab, and it comes from shipping, where if I'm told you are the driver, I suppose the captain of an oil tanker, and you wish to turn it around, you cannot just turn the rudder because it's too big and heavy. But within the rudder, there's a small little rudder. It's called the twin tab. And by turning the small little rudder, that begins to turn the big rudder. And over time, you see the tanker turn 180 degrees. Our job as analysts and the ideas I've tried to instill in the CRA team is to find those twin tabs and see them ahead of the competition so that we can advise clients in advance of what to expect. For example, when it was Mr. Mbeki was, we'll go back even further to our early origin, not our late apartheid era origins. We date to an organization that's been in constant operation in South Africa for almost 100 years. We called the end of apartheid in the early 1980s. We called it that the ANC administration would be far more pragmatic than had been feared, despite its Soviet-era origins, and we were right. You look at the growth and jobs performance of the first decade. We called Mr. Mbeki's demise, and we called the rise of Jacob Zuma. We were the first serious group to host Jacob Zuma for a client briefing at a time when some people said to me, "This is mad. How possibly could you think that man could defeat Thabo Mbeki," which is what he did. We called his demise and we called the rise of Ramaphosa at the same time as warning that the new dawn was not what it seemed to be. It would not be reformist in the main and would get into a lot of trouble. And then we called this blowout that you see now. So there's a track record of success, and the success comes not from, and we employ some very intelligent people. It comes from methodology. Look for those early embryonic signs and read into them where they lead. And if I look at those now, I see a number that make me think that the collective vote here might be off. The first is the ANC's polling shows us that it is on its way to an election defeat. And I cannot, in fact, see how, given the demographics, that if South Africa remains a free society, the ANC could possibly maintain a majority by the end of this decade. Secondly, it's very well established in the data, the relationship between socio-economic circumstances, confidence in the country, protest action, and support for the ANC. And given that we don't think the administration is reformist, we don't even think Mr. Ramaphosa is a reformer, we think that socio-economic circumstances will continue to underperform emerging market averages and accelerate the ANC demise. We also know from our polling that, contrary to what you read in newspapers and on social media, relations between South Africans are not bad, given the history of the country and given the present predicament and the amount of racial nationalist incitement. And that there's a comfortable majority of people, we put it at between 70 and 80%, who actually want to work together to make it work around pragmatic policies, not very different to the ones that I've set out here for you this evening. We also know that South Africa remains a fundamentally free and open society. I've been critical this evening of the government. If I worked in some other emerging markets, so that would be more difficult. When you add together what we see in the polling, what we understand about ANC supporters and the country's economy and how they relate to each other, that reform is unlikely to be on the way, and that we remain a free society where you can organize, choose as you wish. The odds for me, just the cold, clinical, analytical odds, are that the ANC is going to lose an election. And if it loses, it's going to lose at the hands of a pragmatic populace, of people who actually get on a lot better with each other than the mainstream media suggests. And that opens the way to the prospect of a reform-minded post-ANC coalition or administration that could lead South Africa with great success into the 2030s. None of our scenarios must be dismissed. We base the whole theory on complex systems, and complex systems, small changes in present conditions, trigger such huge shifts in future circumstances that single point forecasting doesn't apply. But I am less inclined to go with the majority answer of this group this evening than I am to suggest to you that I think the ANC is going to lose, and there is a serious prospect that a reform-minded administration will replace it and could lead South Africa with some success into the 2030s. David.
Well, thanks, Frans. I think the CRA has a long track record of disagreeing with our clients. So I think that it's not surprising that you answered in that way. But look, I think it is very important to think long-term, as we've done this evening. But we are also in a short game, which is extremely volatile. And there have been a number of questions. So this is Nandi Road in Durban. So scenes of destruction, millions of rands. We have an interview coming out tomorrow morning on our YouTube channel with Mike Schussler, trying to calculate the extent of the economic impact, and it runs into many tens of billions on his estimation, notwithstanding and not including the supply chain disruption. All right, so a number of people are asking, so Michelle says, any guesses on how long this will go on before it is stabilized? Ben asks, what are your expectations regarding how this will play out over the next week or two? What will stop it, or will we witness a continued low-intensity civil war? Frans.
I think it's my call, no fence sitting. I think this thing will lose momentum over the next couple of days and really slow through the weekend and into next week. And then we will begin to take stock. But remember, we go back to the status quo, which is very high levels of violent protest action on a normal day. So we'll go back there. I think this thing washes out, and I think it is unlikely that it is going to spread much beyond where it is active at the moment, which is an odd call from us, because we've done a lot on tracking the xenophobic protests and how they move across the country. And so our leaning immediately is to say, well, that pattern plays out again. I don't think that's going to be the case this time. And but I don't give you that answer with enormous confidence, but got enough confidence that you can judge me according to whether I was right this evening. David.
All right, Frans, so you spoke about the potential for the development of enclaves, and we had a question from Gerard who asks, how do we accelerate a system of stable enclaves? And we also had a question, quite a long question in the chat from Dirk, but you know, his ultimate, his end question there is, his big question is, how do we organize the community better outside of politics? So I think South Africans are obsessed with what's happening on the macro level, party politics, internal machinations of the ANC. How do we begin to think beyond that and think about how we could have these the system of stable enclaves, as Gerard asked?
Well, Gerard, I think we're well on our way to that already. Perhaps the most telling statistic is this, is that 20 years ago, there were roughly an equivalent number of police officers, boots on the ground policemen, and security officers in the country. And today there are roughly 3 times as many private security officers as there are police officers. And with the central definition of the modern state being a monopoly on the use of violence, we could see in that data long before this eruption that the state had in effect surrendered that monopoly. And I saw writing this morning, Anthony Turton telling the story of how policemen had begged private security operators for ammunition during the events of the last couple of days. On private education, on healthcare, now admittedly under threat by NHI, on investment strategy, where for many people with some money to invest, the decisions of the South African Reserve Bank matter much less than Jerome Powell and the Fed, because they have dollarized their assets and their wealth. So I think we've already marched very far down the road of an enclave society. The walled estates in which many South Africans now live passed through a series of generations. And now we have purpose-built, virtually medieval citadels, one of our guests called it one evening, where if you're born in some of these places, you could arguably never leave the walls, and you could live your whole life inside the citadel. Necessity is the mother of invention here, and I think we'll see further moves down this road, and the speed with which the militia were established without much central coordination in recent days. It's just the latest example of this phenomena. Ultimately, an enclave is not a thing, a line on a map, a walled village or a militia. An enclave is a mindset. And that is a mindset that says Pretoria will not provide, to quote the great guru on this stuff, Clem Santa. And this is not a reformist government, and it's not a particularly capable government. And the authority of the state is going to continue to recede. And in those circumstances, you've got three choices. You can exit South Africa financially and physically and take your chances in the rest of the world. You can stick your head in the sand and pretend nothing is happening and be deeply shocked by each consecutive blow up and blow out, and deeply depressed at the lack of reform emerging from the cabinet. Or you can do the third, which is, I would say, a personal observation, how I see the situation, which is to accept that no one's coming to rescue us. There's going to be not for many years any prospect of a reform-minded or capable government. And with that mindset in place and expectations appropriate to it, it becomes very possible to take the strategic decisions that are necessary to ensure for oneself and your community a robust and successful future in South Africa, or at the very least to hold on long enough that you can survive through the very volatile political era that lies ahead. And remember, my advice to you has been, I think the ANC is still going to lose an election this decade. So this is very much still in the beginning stage. It's only going to get crazier. And if you've got a robust a mindset and a robust strategy and a robust community around you, I think you can make yourself robust enough to get through that even in good shape. And remember, others will be leaving. There'll be wonderful opportunities, perhaps, for groups with long-term vision and robustness here, and to live through this successfully long enough that you can take advantage of the upsides that may materialize towards the end of this decade and into the 2030s.
Yeah, Frans, I think the key takeaway message is to be anti-fragile, expect uncertainty, and you'll be able to withstand what comes. All right, well, there are still a couple of hands, and we have loads of questions coming through. So, Frans, with your indulgence, we'll go a little bit over the 7 o'clock end point of this webinar. We still have about 280 people on the call, so everyone's sticking around. All right, well, I see Robert Higgs has his hand up, so I'm going to allow you to talk. Robert, please unmute yourself. And if you could just keep your question short, please, Robert.
In fact, that was not meant to be that way, but I just want to say this is very, very good stuff. Well done to you guys in getting this thing going. I'm former military, etc. It's wonderful that we can talk, and thank goodness that technology allows this. I'm 5th generation, my grandchildren are 7th generation. We've got to make this bloody place work. And we've got to get in by all means to do whatever we can to set it up for everybody's grandchildren. So it's more a statement than a question. But good stuff. Thanks, Frans.
Yeah.
Robert, thank you so much. What is your view, Robert, on the security system here in South Africa, our intelligence personnel? Do you think that they've been taken by surprise here?
Listen, you're speaking to a military guy here. I spent 40 years in uniform. I believe that the current authorities have not placed sufficient emphasis on the military, on the police, and on the professionalizing of the intelligence community. And I think it's something which we need to look at, particularly in the months ahead. We've got to get our act together in a much, much better way, really. You can't go and ignore the rest of the world's example of taking their military, their police and intelligence very seriously. And I think, and I've spoken this, I spoke in Sereti, etc. I said, we've got to take this game more seriously. It's the traditional, it's the regular thing with regard to international relations, the nation state. Your security is your bottom line. You must have a roof above your head. You need security. You need all these bloody things before you can actually start doing all the nice social stuff. And I think that we've not followed the correct path in that regard.
Thanks, Robert. Very good to hear your experience and insights coming through there. All right. Well, Frans, I think we had a couple of financial related questions. One from Diane asking about if there's going to be any impact on the JSE. And there's so many questions, I forget who asked it, but somebody was also asking about, will there be capital outflows? And do you think that the SARB might impose controls on capital leaving the country?
Yeah, well,
that was Graham who asked that. Exchange controls.
Let's quickly do the economics of this. Yeah, bad for South Africa's domestic economic competitiveness, and to what extent the stock market reflects domestic competitiveness. And I mean, it's 10 cent, for example, would give us a hedge there. It's net down for the local market. Yes, on the currency, sharp devaluation lies ahead, is our advice. And we don't provide investment advice. We only provide strategic advice. You must run our ideas past your investment managers before you make decisions based on it. We've been making the case for sharp currency devaluation for a long period of time. And we can see that devaluation occurring even in the face of a weakening dollar, should a confluence of a growing appreciation of stagnant reform coincide with rising appreciation of the extent of domestic political instability. Bonds take a hell of a hit, yields take off as a consequence. Yield differential between South Africa and the 10-year treasury in the US takes off. That increases the cost of borrowing. That puts pressure again on debt to GDP. It becomes a very negative cycle. Tax take is negatively affected. So on the economics of it, it's all net negative for South Africa. And our long-term rand call remains a currency geared for very sharp weakening into the medium term. Partly also, and I don't want to get a bit beyond the brief of this meeting, but on our global stuff, we think the global recovery has run its course, might have. Go read our notes, we'll explain that theory to you. And that the world may see in the next decade a retreat in asset prices that surrender the full quantum of 4 decades of stimulus policy. And in that event, South Africa, given its domestic fragility, the most fragile of the fragile emerging markets by then, can take a real beating on the currency, on interest rates, on bonds. David.
Frans, yeah, I agree with you there. So just looking at some of the public commentary, and there was a question here from Russell. And I think something that's been missing in the analysis has been the role of ethnicity in this. So if you consider that most of the protests are happening in predominantly Zulu areas, KZN, Gauteng, even concentrations of activity around some of the former hostels. And if you also consider, the ANC doesn't like to talk about tribalism, part of their kind of general kind of secular socialist worldview. But it is a factor within the party. And if you consider that there are no Zulu speakers within the top 6 of the ANC, I think there's a sense in which Zuma maybe perhaps not so much the leader of this so-called RET faction, but represents a kind of nascent Zulu nationalism, which really hasn't gone away over the last 150 years or so of its existence. So Russell's question related to that is this not a key marker in the sand on the way to greater political autonomy for Zulus and KZN? And, this was kind of brushed under the carpet during the CODESA negotiations, and proponents of federalism like the Liberals at the time were kind of dismissed by the National Party and the ANC. But do you think that this is indicative of a kind of broader sentiment around kind of ethnic nationalism?
Yeah, quite. I think people try and shy away from it, but it's real. Zulu nationalism had a profound influence on the evolution of Southern Africa for a very long period of time. And it's simply naive to think that that influence will evaporate and disappear. The author R.W. Johnson, controversial, but very, very on the money often, which is the thing that matters, makes the point that South Africa as a unitary state is very difficult to govern. He actually says it can't be governed. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. And certainly merit to the idea that South Africa can be governed out of Pretoria. A more effective model might have been all along a federation of a quasi-independent series, not just 9, series of quasi-independent communities divided along all sorts of interesting historical lines, working together as part of a larger federation. Because that is politically unpalatable, it's not a prospect to be brought about by policymakers. But when policymakers run into hard reality, such as the one of the importance of Zulu nationalism, reality wins. And I said to you earlier, the balkanization or fragmentation of South Africa, it is the very same result as what would accrue in practice from a formal move towards creating a federation. And yeah, I think that they're in this protest business, you get these and all these big markers of the evolution of a society. You get deep and powerful insights, and one of those goes as deep as to raise the question of whether the idea of a union of South Africa 100 and X years later, 10 years later, is actually viable at all. Increasingly, the evidence to me is that it is not. David.
Thanks, Frans. I see that Isaac has his hand up. Isaac, I'm going to allow you to talk. If you could unmute yourself and please keep your question short. Isaac, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, that actually went up by mistake. I'm sorry.
Well, that's okay. If you have nothing to add, we'll move on to Jennifer. Jennifer, go ahead. Sorry about that. Jennifer, go ahead. All right, might be a similar situation with Jennifer. All right, so there were a couple of questions around structural unemployment and that being a facet in the powder keg, which you referred to. This is a question from Gordon. There was another question earlier around the role that collective bargaining agreements play in artificially keeping wages for unionized workers up at the expense of new entrants. Do you think that a lot of the root causes of our unemployment relate to policy, and do you think that that's indirectly playing into this crisis that we're seeing, Frans?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. It all arises from policy in the end. And the drift of policy is simply inappropriate on questions such as labor for the skills base. And there's inertia on education policy reform and the types of reforms necessary to change that. So you end up as a government being trapped in having to firefight your way around the consequences of the policy decisions that you've taken. And if in the face of the evidence of the dire need for reform, which a labour market absorption rate of 40% surely is, can't be anything else, and you still won't move on labour market policy, then yes, the political system will begin to move you. And that is also all that that's about all that we've seen this week. You can reduce it to that just go back a little bit. We became a democracy 25 years ago. So that if a point was reached, such as now, where the country is not effectively governed to the advantage of the majority of its citizens, they might do something about that. And that is what we are seeing in this protest movement, and the anarchic violence around it. Change is unpleasant and can be violent and messy and destructive. But what it's driving towards in the end is a different decision taken at a ballot box. And that decision is only taken because the state remains distant from the experience of people on the ground and unwilling to introduce the policy reforms that would be necessary in order to address socio-economic frustrations. David.
Frans, why do you think that the government is so reluctant to embrace reform? Surely the evidence is there. We need growth. We need jobs. Well, what is the stumbling block there? We had a number of questions related to that in the chat.
Yeah, those are good questions. Very good questions. Surely is a dangerous word in this stuff. But David's smiling because he knows in the team sometimes if a young analyst has been out to see a client and we say, well, how was it? The client says, surely, we got to surely. And many of you on this call have a problem. And the problem is you are successful, which is why you're here and why you're on the call. And you're only successful because you operate in business where when you confront a problem, you do something about it. And one of the greatest challenges that the business and investment community has in understanding the ANC or politics across the board is they think the same rules apply in politics, and they don't. Political decision makers often take decisions that are at odds with the best interests of their country or often themselves, and it brings about their own demise. This is not unprecedented. We're not unique in this as a country. And the reason they do that is that ideology becomes very important. It's a businessman struggle with ideology because you have no room for it if you want to run a profitable enterprise. You must take firm, pragmatic decisions all the time. Politicians in the intervals between elections have the luxury to indulge in ideology. Now, ideology is a very important force in the evolution of the world. Karl Marx, an ideologue, he sat in an armchair and had an idea that continues to inspire revolutions almost 100 years later, not quite, almost that. Inside the ANC, there is a deep well of left-of-center ideological dogma, which says the state should direct economic activity. And debating with hardened ideologues is like debating it's like debating with a wall. I've done it many times. You can get the ideologue to concede high levels of unemployment, and you can get the ideologue to concede the consequences thereof. There are very senior leaders of this government who have had that conversation with us and agree that we're not wrong on the facts of it. They cannot bring themselves to term. And the reason is the deep impression that ideological dogma has on the present administration. And at your peril, do you discount that and say that it can't be, or surely not, because surely after this, the evidence is unambiguous. That's a lot of the reason. Ideological, great majority of the reason for the stasis and reform. A little secondary reason is that across the party, the ANC, and even in the Ramaphosa camp, to a significant extent, there are individuals who would fear the consequences of South Africa becoming a truly successful society, should that lead to mass prosecutions across the board. And there are very few individuals in the senior leadership who, given events of the past 20 years, would sleep easy knowing that there is a ferocious prosecutor on the prowl, seeking to make sure that there is accountability for everything that has happened here, and not just over the past decade, but in the decade before that. And between that fear of the consequences of becoming a truly successful and well-governed society that can only happen if we eradicate the corruption and the ideology, is the great majority of the reason why reform is not just not happening, but why our advice to you is that it is unlikely to happen at all until and that political change will therefore be inevitable and will set up the reform that the current administration cannot countenance. David.
Frans, we still have over 200 people on the call, and there are about 30 questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But what I would encourage you to do is get in touch with us. Sherwin posted his details in the chat. He can do so again. If you would like to follow up on any of these questions, we'd be happy to answer them for you. We'll ping you a direct reply. And also, if you are an institutional client of the CRA, if you're one of our premium clients, that's the corporate category, get in touch with us for a briefing. Frans is also updating his scenarios slides with new material. So there'll be a lot of very interesting data and trends to discuss with you. So do get those bookings in early. Frans is going to be unavailable through August. So if you'd like to speak to him, now's the time to get that booking. And then also to our free trial joiners, if you would like to continue enjoying CRA analysis, you're going to have to please sign up on that subscription link that Sherwin also posted. There's a lot of reports. There's our Monday morning risk alert. There's a treasure trove of data behind the paywall of our website. So if you'd like to continue enjoying access to that, please do formalize your subscription with us. My name is David Ansara. This is the Center for Risk Analysis. Frans, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, and wish you a very good evening.
David, thank you. Thank you to our guests, and we'll talk soon.